she's an 11-year-old girl, and so, that's why, and I've told you guys this before, but I love talking about kids who found their faith when they were young. She's younger than all of you guys, right? And she had it figured out. Now, that's not to say she's good and I'm bad, right? But it's to say this is possible, okay? And that's what we look to say, boy, I'd like to be like St. Maria Goretti. But again, if you look at every saint, they all have a different story, right? We could want to be like Maria Goretti. We could want to be like Mother Teresa. We could want to be like John Paul II. But we'll never be exactly like that person. But we can take those attributes of that person and we can incorporate them into who we are. And so that's what we should do. And that's why we learn about the saints, is we find out what was their secret? What helped them on their path to holiness? Just take a moment and consider God's presence with us here this evening. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for the opportunity to gather together in safety, gather together to learn more about you through some of your great saints. We thank you for the meal that we had and for the family that provided it. We ask that you bless them for their sacrificing, providing it for us. We ask that you send St. Maria here to be with us tonight so that she can help each one of us take one piece of her life that she wants to help us know more so that we can incorporate it into our own lives. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. I want to read a verse from Scripture here first to start, to kind of set the tone a little bit. It's from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 18. Then Peter, approaching, asked him, Lord, if my brother sins against me, how often must I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus answered, I say to you, not 7 times, but 77 times. I think Jesus said that because he knew that there was a huge power in forgiving someone when they've done something wrong to you. Our tendency as humans is to want to get revenge when somebody does something wrong. But that's the way the world thinks. That's not the way that Jesus thinks. And so the saint that I picked tonight is St. Maria Goretti. Now, I know some of you guys that go to St. Maria Goretti probably hear a lot about her. And you probably know her story, and that's great. I've learned, I knew of her story, and I knew quite a bit about her before this, but in this time of studying her for the presentations I had to give to the middle school a couple weeks ago and the ones I'm giving for DTS this week, I've gained a huge appreciation for her. It is a coincidence, I guess, that she came up in the rotation this time. There's a method to me picking the saints that we use, and it's just, okay, we got the merger going on, and now St. Maria Goretti and St. Andrew and St. William are all together. But I think it's also fortuitous that we're doing St. Maria Goretti. And so this idea of forgiveness is central to her story. And she's another one of these saints that came from literally nothing, right? She didn't have a lot of the luxuries of life, yet she had a very deep faith. And so she was born in October of 1890 in a little town about 40 miles south of Rome. And it was like a farming area. They were so poor that they were trying to figure out where they were going to live. Her father was a farmer, but he was too poor to own any land. So what he did is he went to a wealthy landowner and he said, I will provide you, the crops, and if there's anything above and beyond, can I have that for my family? And the landowner felt this was a good deal. Luigi Goretti was his name, and he had his wife and 6 kids. The oldest one was Maria, who at the time when they found this farm was about 8 years old.
And so basically it was Luigi doing all the work, because all the kids were too young to be out helping in the fields. And so they also made an arrangement with this landowner that they could live in this old warehouse that he had as part of the deal, and he agreed to it. And so they now had a place to live. They now had enough food to eat, but that's about all they had. There wasn't much left over for, they didn't have a lot of material goods at the time. And things went pretty well for a couple of years until about May of 1900. And the dad, Luigi, was out working and he got bit by a mosquito, and it happened to carry the malaria parasite. And after about 10 days, he died from this. At the time, 120 some odd years ago, malaria was not a curable disease. And so he passed away from this, which left the family in a great turmoil. What are we going to do? Because he was providing all the labor, which provided the place to live and all the food on the table. So what they decided at the time, Maria was just shy of her 10th birthday. And so they decided that what she would do is she would take on the responsibilities of managing the house and taking care of the 5 younger kids at 9 years old, almost 10 years old. So think about that. And her mother would go out and do all the work in the fields. And that was almost unheard of, but that was their only choice. If this fell through, they'd be homeless. They would have nowhere to live. So they decided that this was the best plan, and it worked. It was working. Around that time, they had a neighbor, and he was about 19 or 20 years old. His name was Alessandro Serenelli, and he started taking a liking to Maria. Now, Maria at this time is like 10 years old, going on 11, and he's 19 or 20. Okay, so, but he was kind of a rough guy, kind of rude, and he would make these comments, and she would just kind of get like, ooh, and she would run away. And the ruder the comments and the greater her reaction, the more he liked it. So he was a little twisted, you could say. Well, one day he made it clear to Maria that he said, Maria, I want you to give up your virginity to me. And she says, no, that's not going to happen. So he made his plans for his next encounter with her. And it was hard for her to tell her mom anything that was going on, because Alessandro, who was like 20 years old, he would help her mom with some of the work around the farm, some of the harder jobs. And so her mom thought he was this great guy. And she didn't know about, kind of how he was treating Maria. And Maria didn't want to tell her mom, because if she told her mom, they'd have to move away, and then again, they'd be homeless. So she had this real struggle, this inner struggle of what she should do. But she decided that she just wanted to take as much of the burden off her mom as possible, so she just kind of bore that internally. And she had a deep faith, and so that helped her as well. So she prayed a lot to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and really, that's kind of how she got through it. So anyway, one day Alessandro shows up at a day when he knew Maria was the only one home, and he had this farm implement about this big. It had a wooden handle. It was actually a file that they used to sharpen the farm implements. And he basically took it and he kind of put it up against Maria's chest, and he said, Maria, you're going to do exactly what I want you to do, or I'm going to kill you. And she said, no. She says, this is sin. God doesn't want this. And, they kind of went back and forth a little bit, and finally he just got so enraged that he stabbed her. And he stabbed her. And he stabbed her. And he stabbed her 9 times. And he stabbed her with such force. Again, she's 11 years old. Okay. It's in July, so she's like 3 months shy of her 12th birthday. So she's not very big. And he stabbed her with such force that 6 of the stabs went in her front and came out her back. And the other 3 didn't come out her back because they hit her spine. And he hit her spine so hard he actually bent the farm implement. And she falls down to the floor, and he thinks she's dead. Well, she was actually just unconscious, but he goes to, I think he was living in the building next door, and he goes and he locks himself in his room. Well, after a time, she comes to. I mean, she's got 9 stab wounds in her. Okay, you can imagine how severe this was. But she comes to, and she crawls to the door, which is about 6 feet away, and she reaches up and she moves the latch, and the door creaks open, And she figures if I can open the door, I can call for help. Well, Alessandro heard the door creak. He came back and he stabbed her 5 more times. And this time he stabbed her quite a bit in the abdomen. And so he punctured her intestines. And so she wound up, this is what actually wound up killing her later on. I mean, the other wounds are bad enough, but this is what killed her, because what happened is that the contents of her stomach and her intestines were leaking into her body cavity. And this causes an infection, and you can have some serious complications, and it's pretty deadly. So anyway, so finally her mother and somebody else comes and they find her and they rush her to the hospital. Now this is not like taking you to a UW hospital, right? You're not med flighted there and there's no ambulances. They have to take her there probably by horse and cart, get her to the hospital, which is no more than probably just, a refurbished house, is what it is. And they start to examine her wounds, and they realize they're pretty severe, and they decide they're gonna have to do surgery. But this whole time, you imagine these wounds, she's like, I'm thirsty, please somebody get me some water. But the doctors couldn't give her any water because they knew if she drank the water would go in and it would leak in through her punctured intestines and in her body, and it would amplify the amount of infection, so they couldn't give her any water. And so they had called the parish priest, and he came and he spoke with Maria, and he said, our Lord from the cross wanted water, but nobody would give him any. Do you offer your thirst up as Jesus did? And she thought about it, and she said, yeah, I do. And she didn't ask for another thing, and she had this peace that just came over her. So she started offering everything that she was going through up for the conversion of sinners. And so they decided they're going to have to do surgery, but she had lost so much blood and she was so small and so weak that they decided that any amount of anesthesia they gave her would probably kill her. So her only chance for survival was to do the surgery without anesthesia, even local anesthesia. And so they had to go in to every wound, and they had to enlarge every wound, and they had to go in and then they had to try and repair every one. And they said that she could feel every movement of the scalpel, every move of the blade, and she never once even cried out. She just continued to offer this up. And so after a time, she came out of surgery, and there was still a lot of internal bleeding, and they just were like, we can't fix this. This is too much. And the doctor came in and he said, Maria, would you please remember me when you make it to paradise? And she goes, well, what makes you think I'm going before you? And he said, you are. And she said, well, in that case, I will remember you. And she said, I also want something else known. And her mom and everybody was around her at that point. I want something else known, that I forgive Alessandro Serenelli for what he did to me, and I want him to be with me in heaven forever. And with that, she died. And so they arrested Alessandro, and Alessandro pleaded innocent. He said he was warding off Maria's attack. And I know you don't believe that, and neither did the authorities. They're like, this 11-year-old girl attacked this 20-year-old man, seriously? And so he wound up being sentenced to jail. They sentenced him to 30 years in jail. And he was so angry, he continued to blame Maria for this. He says if she would have only done what I asked, she wouldn't be dead. And so he was so angry, he was so upset, and he was so unrepentant. And so he was so violent that they had to put him in solitary confinement, because anytime he was around other prisoners, there wound up being violence. And so he couldn't even be around other prisoners at all. And so he spent his time in solitary confinement for the next 6 years. And then one night, and it's hard to tell whether it was a vision or whether it was a dream, different sources say different things, but Maria came to him. And she didn't say anything. She was in this garden, and she was picking white lilies, and she just picked them and she would just lay them at his feet. And she picked and laid 14 white lilies at his feet. And 14 is significant because that's the number of times he stabbed her. 9 the first time and 5 the second time. And he realized that this was a visible sign of her forgiving him. And he received a massive infusion of grace. He was completely repentant. And he realized what he had done. He was horrified by it. And for the first time in his life, he was sorry that he had done this. So he called for the local bishop. The bishop came and heard his confession. I did it. It's all my fault. I killed Maria. I deserve whatever I get. And this was a total turnaround from what he had been before. And his life was completely changed. And so shortly after that, there was all these prayer cards that were printed up because the story got out. And there was all these prayer cards that were printed up. And they were being distributed in the area with Maria's picture on and a prayer for her canonization. And so a time later, I don't know how many years later it was, but there was a gentleman who was working in Rome, and he was digging at the base of a building, and some blocks fell off the top and came down, and they came down on his foot and completely smashed his foot. I mean, the bones were just shattered. His foot was bruised and bloody. It was terrible. They rushed him to the hospital. They examined him and said, "There's nothing we can do for this foot. There's nothing to fix." And so they bandaged him up, and they said, "We're going to schedule the amputation for tomorrow." And so he's laying there in bed, and his wife comes in, and she's got one of these prayer cards of Maria. He says, "We're going to pray to Maria Goretti for your healing." She takes it, sticks it in the side of the bandage, and pray. And the next morning they come in. They have all the tools. They're getting ready to cut his foot off where they need to. They unbandage it, and what they found was a completely normal foot. There was no damage. All the bones were intact. There was no cuts. There were no bruises. It was a normal-looking foot. Total miracle. So the man got up, went back outside, started work, and he didn't miss a day of work, which is pretty remarkable. Because everybody had basically said, "You're going to lose your foot," which means you lose your livelihood. He wasn't going to be able to work anymore. It was going to be a bad situation. And so, word gets out about the miracles, and this push for her canonization starts really picking up some steam. And so Alessandro's life was, like I said, is completely changed. He actually started reading the Bible. He had a prayer life. He was evangelizing the other prisoners. And I mean, it was a total conversion. And it was very obvious that it wasn't a show. He wasn't just doing this to try and get out of jail. And even if he would have been, this is at a time when there was no parole. They didn't let you out. They were like, "Okay, you're sentenced for 30 years, and after 10 years, you can get parole if you do a good job." This was like, you're sentenced to 30 years, you're doing 30 years, and that's the way it was. After 27 years, they paroled him. They're like, it's obvious this guy has changed. He could not have put up this act for 20 years. It's obvious that he's a converted soul. And he was even starting to become involved and become a third order Capuchin, I believe, which is a Franciscan. And when he got out, they just were like, they were so happy to accept him because they saw the conversion that had taken place. And if you think about, some of the other conversions in the Bible, like Mary Magdalene or Saul, who became Paul, that they were pretty spectacular. And this is the kind of conversion that Alessandro had. I mean, he was a murderer and a rapist, right? And so he was pretty changed. And so he gets out of jail, and some of the dates seemed a little weird when I heard him on there, but they said that it was Christmas Eve in 1934, which had been 32 years after he murdered Maria, so it didn't add up exactly. But anyway, he goes to Maria's mom's house because he wants to ask her forgiveness. And so to back up a second, you have to understand that when he murdered Maria, then there was nobody to take on the role of managing the house. None of the other kids were old enough to do this. And so he basically totally destroyed their family. And so Maria's mother couldn't do the farm and manage the kids, so she wound up having to give her other 5 kids away for adoption. And she couldn't even attend Maria's funeral because it was one of the last days she had with her kids. And so Alessandro had destroyed her entire life. And he knew it. And so he was going to her house and he was going to ask for forgiveness. And so he knocks on the door, she opens the door, and he says, "Assunta, do you know who I am?" Assunta was Maria's mom. She goes, "Yeah, I know who you are." He says, "Do you forgive me?" "I'm sorry, do you forgive me?" And she said, "Alessandro, Maria forgave you, and God has forgiven you. How could I not forgive you? And she, in over the next course of time, she actually wound up adopting him as her son. And that night, they went to Christmas Eve Mass together and received communion together. The man who destroyed her family and murdered her daughter. All because Maria chose to forgive. They'd set off this chain reaction of people forgiving each other in this supernatural way, the way that's just not possible. I mean, I can't even fathom the level of forgiveness that you'd have to do to be able to truly forgive that, not just say it, to forgive it. And remember, to forgive something doesn't mean like, oh, it's okay, it's fine. It means, no, what you did was wrong, but I'm not going to hold it against you. And so her cause for canonization just continued to move forward. And in the late 40s, I think 1947, something like that, it's in the sheet that you guys will have in your books. She was beatified by Pope Pius XII. And in 1950, she was canonized. And there were a lot of very unique things about this canonization. First off, she was like one of the youngest saints ever canonized. She was like 11 years, 9 months old. Right? She died on July 6, 1902. This was, and sometimes if you guys ever seen the canonization where they got the pictures outside and everybody's in St. Peter's Square and everybody's cheering and all this, they didn't do that before this. They always had the masses inside. But there were so many people, over 500,000 people showed up for Maria's canonization. They had to move this thing outside. And so this is the first canonization mass that was held outside of St. Peter's in 1950. The other thing is that her mother actually got to be there. So the mother of someone who's canonized rarely, if ever, gets to be at the canonization of their child. And the murderer, the one who killed her, was there. Alessandro was there as well. So this was such a unique thing, this power of forgiveness that Maria chose to forgive just had this ripple effect that just went out from there. It was just truly incredible. And so what's even more incredible is that Alessandro led a very contemplative life. Like I said, he was a third order Franciscan. He just became this beacon of hope and a beacon of goodness that everybody came to. That he died in 1970, and his cause for canonization is actually going on right now. There have been miracles attributed to Alessandro Serenelli, the murderer of Maria Goretti, which is remarkable. The fact, that God chooses. But think about it, right? St. Paul, right? St. Paul was a murderer. Moses was a murderer. All these people. God can do what God can do, and so it just this story is just so. People just can't even believe it. There's just so many things that just don't make sense, right? Because that's not the world we live in. And so the theme is basically that this idea of forgiveness is so powerful that it can change literally millions of lives. And so Maria, like I said, I never really kind of attributed much to her because I didn't know her story this well, but the video, one of the videos I watched was by Father Carlos Martins. And I don't know if you guys know who he is, but when St. Maria came here, he was the priest that came with her. It's kind of a older guy, bald, beard. When St. Jude's relic came like a month ago, he was here, I saw him. He owns these relics. And I saw him walking around. But he did this video on Maria. It's phenomenal. In the video link that I'll post for this, I'll link his video. Because it's like, I thought about, should I just show his video? I mean, it's so good. It's like the best video I've ever seen anybody do on a saint. And you should watch it. It's so powerful the way he tells his story. And he tells some other stories of miracles, a couple that he's experienced through St. Maria Goretti's intercession. But I just, I know there's been a lot with her coming, here like 7 years ago. And there's a lot, sometimes people feel a little maybe worn out by her story and things like that, but really get to know her. We're very privileged to have her be our patron saint here. She is, some people say she's one of the most powerful saints there is, and she's an 11-year-old girl. So get to know her, please. The cards I gave you guys are all third-class relics of hers. So if you don't want them, leave them here. They are blessed objects. They're all blessed, but that's actually a third-class relic. I touched it to the relic that's in the lobby there. One other real
interesting factoid that I found, I think, which also helped me, is that I realized that July 6th, 1902 seemed like a really familiar date to me. And it was. I went back and I looked in my phone, and that's the exact day that my grandfather was born. And I didn't think much about it. It's kind of like, but a buddy of mine's dad died about 2 months ago. He died like right after Steubenville because he got the message that his dad had fallen on the bus home from Steubenville. So this is the end of July. So his dad died early August. And they said that when his dad died in the hospital, the moment that he died, they heard the bell ring in the hospital for another baby being born. And I was like, well, it's not like they're swapping them out or anything like that. But I just thought that was really interesting, that cycle of life, that somebody dies and somebody else is born. And I thought, wouldn't that be interesting if my grandpa was the one that was born right when St. Maria Goretti died? And I just felt this just strange connection. And I realized too, my grandfather was not Catholic. My grandma raised the kids Catholic. But I realized that there's that connection there, that maybe St. Maria Goretti would be part of the reason that he's dead. So with the grace of this mystery being mortification and purity, you could probably tell why I picked St. Maria Goretti. I mean, purity for sure, right? She was willing to die rather than give up her virginity. But also mortification. I mean, think about what she went through when she was going into that surgery, right? She offered up all that sufferings. I mean, like my knee hurts, right? And I'm just a baby, right? And I struggle to offer that up. And she's got 14 puncture wounds puncturing organs in her intestines, and she's not having anesthetic, and I mean that level of mortification, and she's 11 years old. Okay, that's incredible. That's just incredible. Some people say she's one of the most powerful saints in heaven because of just her stamina of what she was able to do. And she's an 11-year-old girl, and so that's why, and I've told you guys this before, but I love talking about kids who found their faith when they were young. She's younger than all of you guys, right? And she had it figured out. Now, that's not to say she's good and I'm bad, right? But it's to say this is possible, okay? And that's what we look to say, boy, I'd like to be like St. Maria Goretti. But again, if you look at every saint, they all have a different story, right? We could want to be like Maria Goretti. We could want to be like Mother Teresa. We could want to be like John Paul II. But we'll never be exactly like that person. But we can take those attributes of that person and we can incorporate them into who we are. And so that's what we should do. And that's why we learn about the saints, is we find out what was their secret, what helped them on their path to holiness, and we just try and do those things. And Maria's, like I said, she was 11 years old and had to figure it out, right? She didn't have all the worldly stuff that she was attached to, right? Maybe that was part of it. Right? She didn't have the newest iPhone. She didn't have, a bunch of friends around. She didn't have, a $60 million high school to go to. She didn't have any of that stuff. So maybe all she had was her faith. I don't know. Sometimes we think that poor people don't have the advantage that we have, and maybe materially they don't. But there was a spiritual richness that she had, and maybe it was because she wasn't attached to anything in the world. I don't know. I can only guess. But we want to try and emulate the stories, or listening to the stories about her, trying to emulate the things that she did. And so, just learn more about her. That's all you need to do, is just learn more about Maria, learn more about any of these saints, because they've all got lessons for our lives. And that's how we find our path to heaven, is by and then asking for the prayers of these saints, like me asking for Maria's intercession with my grandfather, who I've never met. He died when I was a year old. Never met him. But wish I would have. Hope I do someday. But I plan to see him in heaven. So do the best you can and try and get to know some of these saints. Amazing. And so, so how is scourging, purity and mortification? Well, they say that when Jesus was scourged, that was the payment, if you will. I'm forgetting the word right now. But that was the payment for all of the acts of impurity that mankind would commit.
And, you know, when I was a little kid, I'd hear, you know, when they would read the Passion Easter, they had him scourged. I'm like, okay, you know, I don't know what that was, right? I had no idea what that was. And I think it finally made sense to me when I first saw the Passion of the Christ. I don't know how many of you guys, students, have seen that movie. If you do watch it, I would recommend you watch it alone. And here's why. They say when you watch a show or something like that with a group of people, that the amount of responsibility you have for what's going on is divided amongst all those people. When you watch something with a smaller group and a smaller group, there's less of that to go around, if that makes any sense. I'm explaining it poorly. But when I first watched that movie, I watched it alone in a hotel room on a business trip. I said, I'm going to watch this thing. And it affected me because there was nobody else around to process that with, or to share, to share, you know, the amount of distress I was under. I had to deal with that myself. And it was intense. It was really intense, but it was really powerful. I think it was powerful in a good way. But it really helped me understand what the scourging was and why this is such an important thing, an important mystery for us to contemplate. So I would recommend that you do that. If you have seen the movie, go watch it again, and pay attention to that scene. It's brutal to watch. I still can't watch it all the way through, you know, without turning away at least for part of it. But it really helps you understand some of what Jesus went through, and that isn't as bad as what it actually was to Jesus. There's a lot of that scene that you can kind of hear in the background while other stuff is going on. So it was intense. And so when you pray this mystery of the Rosary, really contemplate what that means and think about what the